inside. A few people still remained outside, eager to sell. We didn't really have the intention to buy anything, but I still combed through the last pieces of used crap people set out. I always think I'm going to find some kind of amazing treasure, but always end up questioning my purchases hours later. I found myself digging through a shoebox full of old board games. I thought I might be able to find a new game for all of us to play. I also figured since it was the end of the day, I might get it for super cheap. At first, I only saw games that looked in too bad of shape to even buy. That, or it was a game I knew my friends wouldn't want to play. I've always been a board game fan, but not so much my friends. I had to beg them for months to play D&D with me, and they were only willing to play it for my birthday. I'm always trying to find new games that might interest them. I was ready to give up, but then I saw a game at the bottom that I'd never heard of. Task with Friends, with the tagline, "The game you and your friends will never want to put down." The box looked colourful and pretty worn out, but not so bad that we couldn't play with it. It just looked well loved. I tried to open it up, but the sides were taped down. I mean, it makes sense. You don't want all the pieces to come flying out after all. I didn't see a price tag, or sign for the price, so I found the owner and asked her. "Excuse me, how much are you charging for the game?" I said eagerly to the woman, while admiring the bright-coloured box that lacked any company branding or trademarking. "Oh, that old thing. I don't know. Do you have $1 on you?" the woman said as she put the yard sale leftovers into one big box. As she told me the price, I perked up and started to dig through my purse. She either got annoyed with me taking too long or just wanted to be nice and told me to just take it. She immediately started to pack up her box again. "So, is the game any fun?" I said to her awkwardly. I actually never played it. My friend Jen gave it to me a few years back because her kids got obsessed over it or something, so she just wanted to get rid of it. She thought my family would enjoy it, but we just never got around to playing it, she said, with her back facing me. I kindly thanked her and called for my friends to come over to see what I got. As I called for them, I could see their curiosity over what I found. That excitement was quickly lost when they saw I had a board game in my hands. They rolled their eyes, knowing that I would try and get them to play it with me. "Kate, you know we don't do the board game thing," Aaron said to me, annoyed. "Come on, guys, you've all been going on and on all day about how bored you are. At least try. This game looks really fun. I actually haven't played this one before, so we can all learn together," I said as I saw their faces start to grow curious again. James came up to me and gestured at the box in my hand. I gave it over to him, hoping that he would be convinced to play after looking at it. I knew if he was down to play, everyone else would be too. As he held the box, I could see the expression on his face change from doubt to excitement. "Damn, this game looks like fun. Let's go play," he said with a giddy tone I'd never heard him use. He started to jog in the direction of his house with me close behind, and the rest of our friends slowly walking behind me, looking confused as to why James was so excited to play a board game when he was normally the person most against them. We all made it back to James' house. We walked in and were greeted by his mum, confused as to what made her emotionless son so excited. As we stood in the entryway, not sure what to say, we heard him calling us from the basement. We ran down the steps to see the game fully set up on the floor and ready to play. He was sitting on a pillow, reading the instructions with intense concentration. "James, are we actually playing this game?" Bree whined. "Yes, we are. I promise, if you just sit down and start to play, you will have fun. I had a chance to learn the rules while you guys got here," James insisted as he shuffled a pile of cards one last time. After a few minutes of back and forth, everyone was task. If that task is completed, you may move the number of spaces that are specified on the card. Once you see the card, it will say secret or public at the top. If it's a secret card, do not read it out loud. This task must be completed without anyone noticing or questioning the action on the card. For example, hold someone's hand, sing a song, insult someone, etc. Just complete the task without anyone calling you out. If a player does something you believe to be a secret task, say out loud, deceiver. If the player was caught, they will show their card and fail their task. Do not move any pieces. If the person who calls out a deceiver wrongly accuses the player, then they must move back one space. The accused player will keep that card and continue to try and complete the task. Once you have successfully completed a secret task, you may announce task complete and move your token forward as many spaces as specified on your task card. If you pull a public card, you must read it out loud. These cards will include things like saying the alphabet backwards, don't say Amora until your next turn, singing a karaoke song, playing dead for 1 minute, etc. Some cards have time limits and specific instructions. Every card will clearly state the task. The player who gets their token to the end of the board wins. The game will start with the player who lied last drawing a card. Take turns drawing one card at a time, with the person to your right going next. Have fun! James folded the paper instructions up and sat them by his side, asking if anyone had questions. No one said anything. It seemed like they all understood the game fine. Or maybe they just didn't care yet. "Alright, let's get the game started," James proclaimed, but was met with blank stares. "Come on guys, I just read the rules. You should know how the game starts. We have to start with who lied last." Everyone remained silent. No one wanted to say their last lie. "This is so dumb. I guess I'll go. I told my mom that Henry wasn't hanging out with us when I left the house. There, I'll go first," Bree blurted out as she leaned forward to grab a card. As she looked at it, she rolled her eyes. "This is so dumb. Why are we playing this game?" "Come on, Bree. It can't be that bad. Can you read it out loud?" Henry said, sensing that the card was embarrassing. "Ah, public card. Pretend to be a cow for 3 minutes." She threw the card down and looked at Henry, who was to her right, expecting her turn to just be over and not wanting to even try. The rest of the group started to laugh and encourage her, chanting her name and begging her to do it. After about a minute, she gave in and got down on her hands and knees. When she first started, she was annoyed, staring daggers at Henry. As her time ran down, I could see in her face her feelings towards the game change. When the timer went off, she didn't stop for a few seconds. She kept going because she was laughing so hard. "That was so fun. Someone moved my token up one space. Henry, it's your turn now," Bree said with a giggle and a newfound excitement. Henry looked at her in disbelief. He was so used to her cold exterior, but liked that this game made it melt away. Henry picked up his card. He motioned, zipping his lips shut, and shook his head. Me, Bree, and James all squealed in excitement, with the rest of the group looking lost, not understanding what they missed that got us so excited. Since Henry had a secret card, it was AJ's turn. She was chuckling along, but clearly just doing it because she didn't want to look dumb for asking us what was so funny. She pulled her card and read it out loud. It's a public card," she said with a dry tone, trying to gauge the room and observe everyone else as they celebrated her public card. "It says I have to do jumping jacks until my next turn." As she stood up, everyone in the room cheered her on, except for Aaron. As she got to her feet, she paused and looked over at Aaron. I can imagine he felt like the only sane person in the room and wasn't sure what was going on. After a second of hesitation, she started her jumping jacks. Aaron looked around at us, eyeing him down desperately, waiting for him to read his card. By the time he finally picked up his card, AJ had started to laugh while doing her jumping jacks. "Sorry, it's a secret card," Aaron said nervously as everyone wiggled with happiness. "Well, looks like it's my turn," I said as I leaned forward, but was cut off by Henry quickly standing to his feet and lunging towards AJ, tackling her to the ground, interrupting her jumping jacks and making a loud thump as they hit the ground. "Hell are you doing? What's wrong with you?" Aaron yelled in a serious tone that turned into him trying not to laugh by the end of the sentence. "I'm calling a deceiver on that tackle, Henry," Bree stated with a laugh. Okay, you got me," Henry said while still laying on AJ from his tackle. They both smiled over the event, even though it clearly hurt when they hit the floor, but you have to admit that one was tricky. I tried to start my turn again, but was interrupted by Aaron. "Ha! Task completed." I yelled at Henry and didn't get caught. "I get to move 2 spaces," he said as he smugly moved his token 2 spaces on the game board. We kept playing the game for hours. We finished the first game and everyone wanted to play again. And again. And again. I looked around at them in disbelief. It felt impossible that all my friends were enjoying a board game. It was a dream come true. After years of begging, finally. Normally at hangouts like this, by 10 p.m, Bree and Henry would wander off to make out in some closet. AJ goes home to sleep, and Aaron, James and I are left to awkwardly try and find something to do with just the 3 of us. It got to be 2 a.m, and we were either exhausted, or our parents calling us telling us to come home, or we would be in serious trouble. We all went back to our houses, but all had a hard time going to sleep. We stayed up until 5 a.m. for some of us, just talking about the game over text. Strategies, when we could play again. Funny things that happened that night. We couldn't get enough. The games we played started out pretty simple. No tasks got too wild, and while we really loved to play, it wasn't like it was taking over our whole lives. Not yet, at least. Because we played the game at James's house the first time, we ended up just keeping it there. Even though the game was technically mine, we always hung out at his place, so it just made sense. It was around 10 a.m. the next day when our group chat started to blow up with everyone asking when we could get together that day. Now, because it was summertime and we were all teenagers, we either had work in the mornings or most of us slept until noon, but not me. I was always up early waiting for my friends to get up so I had something to do, or trying to make some money as a dog walker. That being said, I was shocked when I saw that everyone was up, and everyone claimed to not have work. James didn't have a job at that point, so of course he was free, but everyone else was too. That did not happen often. We all met up at James's place at around 11 a.m. that same day. Everyone eager to play. We must have played 10 games that day. The games consisted of us doing accents, being banned from saying certain words, backflips, and so on. Nothing too weird. We realised after a few games that we never got a repeating card. Not one time. This was strange, because there were probably 200 cards in the deck. But even with us playing a dozen games, every card was new. I knew I had a couple of dogs to walk that evening, but texted the owners to cancel. No way was I going to leave while all my friends were enjoying a board game this much. I knew AJ said something about her having a shift at 4 p.m, but when the time got close she went to the other side of the room and called out of work. She didn't even mention it to us or talk about it. She just stood up, walked to the corner, talked to her manager and came back. No one thought anything of it. After a few minutes, she loudly proclaimed, "Task completed," moving her token up 3 spaces. We looked around confused at what what task she had, and the card said, "Call out sick to work." We were surprised by this card, to say the least. It was the first time a card had to do with something outside of the players. Everyone else in the group cancelled any plans they had for the rest of the day, although AJ was the only person who completed a task for it. It was around 11 PM, which made it a full 12 hours of the game. Bree pointed out that we forgot to eat any food all day. After thinking about it, I realised that I hardly drank any water and went to the bathroom like one time, all day. Things started to get out of hand that night. AJ pulled a card that said to go into a closet with the player to her left and kiss them for 5 minutes. Of course, that player was Henry. Bree was not happy, but she knew how serious everyone was about the game. She told him she wasn't okay with it, but he insisted that it was just a game and it wouldn't mean anything. It was worth 4 points for both people who would go into the closet. AJ and Henry stood up and went to find a suitable space, all while Bree freaked out and said she would end things with Henry if he went through with it. It was never completely clear what Henry and Bree were. They don't like to use boyfriend and girlfriend, but everyone knew they were a thing. Aaron tried to call it off, saying this wouldn't be worth it and to just stop, but it was like they didn't even hesitate. Bree sat on the carpet and started to cry as the timer on her phone counted down an agonising 5 minutes. I thought I would either hear kissing or nothing at all, but instead I heard talking. It started as soft whispers, then crying and yelling. They stayed in for about 2 minutes, then came tumbling out. "That's it, Henry. I can't believe you would do that for a game. We are over," Bree said with a red, wet face. Henry came and silently sat down with AJ. AJ was now beet red as well. Despite 3 of my friends just going through something I couldn't wrap my head around, they all looked at James calmly and nodded for him to pull his card. No one had moved any tokens forward, so it was clear they failed their task of kissing in the closet. James hesitantly leaned in for a card and read it to himself, as we were bombarded by Bree, AJ and Henry, all saying, "Task completed," and then shot confused faces at each other. They all threw down their cards and moved their tokens forward. Bree's card said, "Break up with Henry." Henry's card said, "Make AJ cry," and AJ's card said, "Tell Henry you love him." All those cards were worth way more than the stupid kissing card, so the kissing task was ignored and they all individually completed our tasks without ever communicating it with each other. They all saw opportunities to complete a task worth more points and they took it. After this moment, it was like nothing even happened. The girls stopped crying and started laughing and saying how impressive the completion of the tasks were. "Wait guys, something is wrong here. Do you not see it?" Aaron said with concern, trying to take a break from the game. "Oh, stop. You are just jealous you didn't get to move 6 spaces," Bree said with arrogance. "No, I'm not talking about that. Does no one find it weird that the cards are using our names now? Not only that, but the cards are somehow interacting with other cards to almost try and make bad things happen," James blurted. As he said that, it was like we all froze in our spots, all looking at each other, realising how hungry and tired we were, looking around at the room, seeing how big of a mess we made. Bree grabbing Henry's hand with a look of sadness and coming to grips with how they hurt each other for a game. I looked down at my arm and was reminded of the crud things I had drawn on my arm with Sharpies in order to move 1 space in an earlier game. I saw Aaron's jeans that were now cut into shorts with some kid scissors. I looked at James's legs and saw his one shaved leg lying crossed over the untouched hairy one. I looked at AJ and saw she had a huge purple bruise on her arm. At that moment, I remembered feeling like an addict trying to get off drugs. I knew one more time, just to feel the high of this dumb game again. I think we need to take a break from this game, guys. It's getting kind of weird and out of hand. I murmured with the strength that I somehow mustered up. It was like telling an alcoholic you were taking away their beer. They all looked horrified at the idea of not playing the game for even a moment. Just then, James's mum came downstairs and was horrified at what she was looking at. 6 dishevelled teenagers, all sitting in a circle, looking like they had all just been through a war. Not only that, but her whole basement was a mess. James, what the hell happened to your leg? Are you all playing that dumb game again? I can't believe this. Everyone, out of my house. James, you are grounded, his mum shouted with rage in her voice. We all ran out of his house, not saying a word to each other, just trying to get home and get some food. As I sat in my kitchen with my long-sleeved sweatshirt covering my now inked-up arm, I tried to eat a sandwich I made myself. I was starving. I could feel and hear my stomach growling, but my need to play the game was so much stronger. So strong, I didn't even want to eat. I sat at my dining room table staring at that sandwich for what felt like an eternity, telling myself that I needed to eat and I'd feel better if I did. But somehow the thought of the game was taking up all my energy. I was holding back the urge to text my friends. It took every ounce of self-control I had left. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, and I involuntarily grabbed my phone so fast it was in my hand before I could even think about it. It was James in our group chat. Hey guys, so do you think that was a long enough break? I think I can find where my mum put the game and bring it to that old treehouse back behind Mr. Baker's house. I couldn't hold back anymore. I had to play again. Before I knew it, I was sneaking out of my house trying to remember where the old treehouse was. As I ran through the neighbourhood, my phone lit up with texts from my friends saying they were on their way. After running around for a while, I found the treehouse. I couldn't believe I had such a hard time finding it, considering how much time a few of us used to spend in it during middle school. I could hear all of their voices sounding annoyed, as I was the last one to get there. I climbed up the old wooden ladder to find all my friends sitting in a perfect circle, barely able to see the board or each other. It was around this time something strange happened within the game. It wasn't about winning the game necessarily, it was about playing as many games as possible and completing as many tasks as we could. If anyone won a game or finished a task, everyone felt a high, not just the winner. Because of this, players stopped calling each other out for trying to complete secret tasks, so people stopped being so secretive to complete secret tasks. They still kept them a secret because it was a rule of the game, just no one called them out. This made us all more ruthless. I sat down on the hardwood in between Bree and James. Our next game began. AJ drew a card first, and it was a secret card. She didn't seem giddy. She looked flush and scared. In fact, it felt like the mood had shifted with everyone. We weren't laughing our butts off anymore. We were terrified to stop playing. It was something in our guts that made us have to play, like a virus growing in us, desperately trying to get out. Next, Aaron drew a card and read it out loud. "Hold your breath for 5 minutes," he whispered with confusion. "How am I supposed to do that?" he said, trying to not get worried. It's not that the card was all that bad, it's that he knew he would stop at nothing to make it happen. He told us to keep playing the game while he did it and got a timer up on his phone. He took a few deep breaths, then held his nose shut and became extremely focused, not making eye contact with anyone. Next it was James's turn. He had a secret card and didn't show much emotion towards it. Next, Bree nervously took a card, and yet again. It was a secret card. In fact, we all drew a secret card until it was Aaron's turn 45 seconds, and he was really focusing, and we didn't want to make him draw a card while trying to finish his task. As we sat and watched our friend become more and more red from holding his breath, we found ourselves in complete silence, other than the wind weaving its way through the trees outside and the soft sound of crickets in the distance. We all just stared at each other, terrified of what was on those secret cards. I knew I had to use every little bit of self-control I had left in my body to not try and complete the task on my card. I was betting that's why everyone was being so quiet. They all had tasks that they didn't want to do but felt the uncontrollable urge to do it. My card said that I needed to remove one of James's fingers by any means necessary. It was worth 10 points. I couldn't believe I wanted to complete it so badly, but I was frozen figuring out how to do it. As I stared at him, I noticed he was looking over at Bree. I figured that his card had something to do with her. It seemed like everyone was fixated on someone else. I glanced down at the timer Aaron had, and I was amazed to see he had been holding his breath for almost 2 minutes. Just as I was about to comment on it, chaos broke loose, everyone jumping onto someone else, making it one big pile of people, viciously grabbing each other. I didn't read their cards myself, but it was clear by their actions what their tasks were. Of course, as you know, I was going for James's fingers, but James's was ripping at Bree's ear. Bree was pulling Henry's hair out. Henry was tearing at AJ's neck, and AJ was trying to open my mouth to get my tongue. For a solid 30 seconds, we were all attaching each other when Aaron passed out from holding his breath. This seemed to snap us out of our trance for a bit. We ran over to our friend and checked his pulse. After we realised he was still breathing, we got lost in the game again, and all jumped on each other to keep brutalising one another. Just as I got my teeth around James's pinky finger, we saw a bright flashlight coming through the cracks in the treehouse and froze. A police officer popped his head through the bottom entrance to the treehouse and looked at us in horror. He saw Aaron out cold in the corner, alone with the rest of us, in a pile of blood and ripped out hair. The officer grabbed us one by one and practically threw us to the ground, where another officer put us each in handcuffs. We had hours and hours of questioning that night, but we were all released by sunrise. No one was badly injured, just a lot of cuts, bruises, and a few patches of hair missing. Even Aaron was okay. Honestly, Aaron made it out in the best shape. We all got grounded for the rest of the summer. All the parents agreed that we needed to stop spending time together, because they insisted on us having some beef between us all. None of us mentioned the board game was at the treehouse that night, because we didn't want them to take it away from us. We knew we had to play it again. However, they caught onto it and banned us from ever playing it again. We spent the next 3 weeks of summer miserable. Each one of us tried to fill the hunger to play the game by playing other board games or attempting to remake it, but it wasn't the same. It was the night before school started and I got a message from James through Skype. Our parents banned us from talking to each other, but it seemed my parents and James's parents forgot about Skype. He told me I had to come over right now. I managed to hop out my window and ran for James's house. I got to his house in what felt like record time and jumped down the fire escape to the basement. There I saw the rest of my friends all sitting by the fireplace weeping. As I got closer I saw they were covered in ash. I saw tiny little bits of what was left of the game lying out on the ground. She burned it. My mum burned it, James said in between tears. Everyone was desperately trying to find any pieces that were left of our precious game. Some of them rubbed the ashes of the game on their faces and arms to try and feel something again. As I watched them, I saw something in the corner of my eye. I looked over to our normal hangout area and saw it. I saw the board game game sitting out. Not just the box, but the whole game was out and ready to play. Are you sure that your mum burnt it, James? I said as my eyes got glazed over, looking at the beautiful board game sitting out for us to enjoy. Yes, I'm sure. She did it right in front of me, so I'd stop looking for it. Just as James finished his sentence, he looked at me, and then at my eyeline. He saw the game. The next week of our lives was a whirlwind. After James's mum burned the game, and it reappeared, we all ran away with the game. We stole a car from AJ's mum after we got a task card for it and left town. We would play the game in the car, in random fast food restaurants, and sometimes in parks. It's all we did all day. We would fall asleep playing the game, and only manage to eat maybe a bag of chips or something small during the day. We kept moving because we didn't want to be found. In that week we all managed to lose our jobs and all missed the first week of our senior year of high school. All because we were addicted to a board game. I still remember the last game we ever played. It was a late Sunday night. We were actually in our town, sitting in an old barn near the treehouse we sat in before. All because the board game told us to. Up to that point, we were hanging out far away from home. We didn't want to be so close. We knew we could be found easily by our families and the authorities if we were too close, but we had no choice. We were slaves to the game. At this point, we were in bad shape. With every new game started, we broke down a little bit more. We surrounded the board with tired eyes and growling stomachs, missing teeth and bruised bodies, concussed heads and broken toes. Please, we have to stop. I can't do it anymore. I want to go home, Bree said as we were about to start our next game. I can't imagine not playing this game. It's all I ever want to do. I think I might die if I couldn't play it. I know the game hurts us, but it would hurt so much more if we stopped playing it, Henry said with a gravelly voice. Guys, why are we talking? We have to play again, Aaron said while trying not to cough. I know we have to. I've never hated something and loved something so much in my whole life, Bree remarked. We started the game with shaky hands, moving slowly and holding our breath whenever someone looked at their card. AJ went first. She reached down and picked a card, cringing to herself after reading it in her head. Next was Bree. She rolled her eyes and she read off the words. Public card. Waterboard. The player to your right for 5 minutes. Both players move 8 spaces, Bree timidly said as she glanced at James sitting next to her. I can't say we really knew how to waterboard someone, but we laid him on his back with his legs elevated and dripped water over him. We let him take a card for his turn before Bree started the waterboarding, so we didn't have to wait for 5 minutes for them to be done. His card was a secret card. We continued the game with the awful background sounds of gagging and choking. Next, it was Aaron's turn. He read his card and winced. He closed his eyes tight and opened them again, as if he was hoping he was in a dream. As he opened his eyes, he slowly looked at all of us, making eye contact with each one of us. Just then, James was done being waterboarded, and he and Bree came to join us. I was so glad they were done, not just because I was sick of the sounds, but because it meant they got to move 8 spaces. Aaron stood to his feet slowly. I prepared myself, because I figured he was about to hurt us. In an instant, he ran out of the barn and into our stolen car. We all looked around confused as to where we went, but kept playing the game as he drove off. Next, it was my turn. Public card. Jump off the roof of the barn. 9 points, I said out loud nervously. Henry and AJ jumped up and started to walk outside, not even questioning if I would do it or not. They weren't wrong in the assumption. Before I could even think We knew we had to keep playing. Next, Henry took a card. He picked it from the pile with his eyes closed and brought it to his face while peeking just enough to see the words on the card, then closed his eyes again, trying to pretend he never read the words in the first place. Next, AJ took a card. Even though it was a secret card, I knew it was about me. She glanced down at my ankle right after her eyes left the card. Just as James was reaching for his card, we saw Aaron walk back into the barn. We all sat in shock as his silhouette became clear and vivid in the doorway. Blood trickled down his arms and hands, dripping on the dirt as we all stared at each other. His eyes were blank at first, but then turned to pain. We watched him as he walked from the doorway to the game board, blood dripping on the game as he moved his token 30 spaces. Aaron, what have you done? 30 spaces, AJ muttered in fear. James, I'm so sorry I had to, Aaron whimpered as sat in the dirt with his secret task card crinkled in his bloodied fist. Tell me what you did right now. What the hell does your card say? Show us, James yelled as he stood to his feet. Just as James was about to jump onto Aaron, Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out some matches we used to start small campfires while we had been on the run. We all stood still waiting to see what he was about to do as he lit 3 matches and threw them into the nearby hay bales, igniting the whole inside of the barn. Without hesitation, AJ saw the opportunity and stomped on my ankle as hard as she could. If it wasn't broken before, it sure was now. I looked down at it to see it now bent sideways. She then stomped on my other ankle, not breaking it, but making it so I couldn't walk. She moved her token 12 spaces. Even though I was in agony from the pain, I still felt such an intense high from her moving so many spaces. Aaron dropped his card in the midst of everything happening. James fell to his feet to see the card and started to weep as he read it out loud. Secret card. Kill James's mom. Move 30 spaces, he said with anger bubbling up. I can't believe you would do that for a dumb game. How could you do this to me? I couldn't control myself. Come on, you know what I mean. I couldn't control myself. Don't do anything you will regret, Aaron said cautiously. Oh, I think it's a little too late for not doing things we regret, James said as he jumped onto Aaron, choking him with all his strength. It seemed at that moment he was able to break free from the control of the game. He wasn't feeling the high of someone else completing a task. He just felt hate. Red, hot hate. I was overwhelmed, to say the least. The barn was in flames. James was trying to kill Aaron. And to make matters worse, AJ out of nowhere jumped up and dug a pocket knife into Bree's stomach. Now Bree and AJ were in a fighting match too. Henry and I sat across from each other in disbelief at our surroundings. He looked at me with death in his eyes as he reached for a card. It wasn't even his turn, but I don't think he cared anymore. He knew the others would be occupied for a while. The fire was getting bad. I knew I had to get out of that barn as soon as I could. Because of the damage done to my ankles, I couldn't walk, so I dragged my body out of the barn. Taking the game with me, I made it a few feet and looked back to see Henry not moving. He set his card down on the board before I started to drag it with me, and I read it as I continued to crawl. Secret card. Let the fire overtake you. Move your token to the finish line and win the game. I was able to get out of the barn with the board game in hand. I sat and watched as the flames overtook Henry. He didn't even flinch when he caught on fire. As I saw it happen, I moved his token to the end space so he could win the game. I felt an intense high overtake my body as the game was complete. Only a few moments after Henry caught fire, the whole barn came down. body around like a toddler, not getting their way. I remember them giving me some kind of sedative and waking up in the hospital. I was the only person to make it out alive that night. All I could say to the doctors and my parents was that I needed the game, that I had to play the game. It was the only meaning to life. It was the only reason I had to live. My parents got me a great lawyer, and I got out of everything by pleading insanity. Our families all knew the right people and had the right money to ensure the word never got out about the deaths. They even managed to make the death of James's mum disappear. When they told me my friends were all dead, I didn't have much of a reaction. I just kept asking where the game was. When they eventually told me the game was gone and never coming back, that's when I lost it. They had to put me into restraints because I kept hurting the hospital staff from my meltdowns. I started to threaten the staff and told them all the horrible things that would happen to them if they didn't get that game back to me. I eventually ended up in a psychiatric hospital. I yelled and screamed so much that I never had my voice. I hardly ever slept because all I thought about was the game and how I craved to play it again. My skin was red and torn up from my insistent picking due to the withdrawals. After months, I felt numb. Maybe from all the drugs they pumped me up with. Or perhaps I was so used to the withdrawals, I didn't feel it as much. It still felt like I had an uncontrollable urge inside my bones, but I was able to hide it. They then sent me home after a while. I knew I had to mask my emotions for the game, pretend I didn't care anymore, even if it killed me inside to say it out loud. I walked into my bedroom, and I felt like I was being treated like a baby. My old bed frame was gone, and it was just the mattress on the floor. All my sharp shelves were taken down, along with anything else I could possibly hurt myself with. I rolled my eyes, but knew my parents had to make these changes for me to even come home. I sat on my bed and I looked around at my room, now with a doorknob that locked from the outside to keep me in, as well as bars on my windows. I searched my room desperately to find something to take up my mind. That's when I dug through my closet and I saw it. I saw that beautiful, colourful box that I came to know so well, just hiding in the back of my closet, waiting to be found. I knew it came back the first time it was destroyed, but it was feeling like it was a one-time thing. But here it was, patiently waiting for me to come and play it. I ripped open the box, giving myself a paper cut in the process, and started to play the game by myself. With all that being said, I can finally say, task completed, and share what my first card said in that solo game. Secret card. Spread the word about this game online so more people can join us. Move 20 spaces. So, what do you say? Care to come join me for a game? I'm not homeless. I have a home. I just don't own it. But it's mine, and I work to keep it. Every city has its fair share of abandoned buildings to squat in, but usually you've got to deal with either cops or shitty neighbours. The Andale high-rise has neither. Police stay away, so do the locals. As a stranger from out of town, I stumbled across the place on my first night in the city and thought it a little strange that a 28-storey tower block had been left to rot. Every window black, every light in the courtyard smashed. No cars in the lot, no booth for a guard, not even barbed wire on the fence. Barely half a mile from a playground filled with shouting drunken teenagers, but none of them straight in the direction of Andale. No fires or music or bottles hurtling through the air. It was silent. Inside I found that the lobby had been torn to shit, double doors ripped open, and left that way for what looked like years. Easy access for the curious, but I was the only one there. Most of the first story had collapsed. Waterlogged ceiling tiles turned to mulch by shitty British weather. I know water is invasive, but it had practically fucking colonised the place. So bad, algae was growing up the walls. Even the elevator shaft was flooded. My own reflection, looking back at me as I peered through brackish water and caught a glimpse of the old rusted carriage just a few feet below. I couldn't help but think about standing on top of it, waist high, and reaching down to pull open the emergency hatch. Only natural to wonder what was down there. Little metal box soaking in pitch black water for years and years. I thought about pressing the button, calling it up, and seeing the elevator rise in spite of all logic, an image I still think of from time to time. Meanwhile, the empty shaft loomed above, cables whistling in the wind. I've learned not to linger by it. If you look up, you'll sometimes see something ducking out of the way, pulling its head through the doors before you get a good look. It finds it awfully funny, even tries to make a game out of it, like peekaboo. Play too much though, and it starts to pop up elsewhere. Any open door becomes an invitation, sent more than a few people running for their lives in the middle of the night. But bad news for them. That thing is more than free to leave this place if it's part of a game. If you ask about Andale, most people just shrug or laugh. Kids will talk about it same way they talk about any haunted house. Difference is, no one dares anyone to go up there. No one uses it to get pissed or high. No one sneaks into the basement to have a risky little fuck. No one hides their stashes there. It has all the hallmarks of your classic urban legend. Only people actually stay away. They'll laugh and joke and tell scary stories, but they treat the soil it's on like it houses a radioactive leak. And the council, I'm surprised they haven't knocked it down, but they, out of everyone in the city, have the most to lose by talking about it. They built it in the mid-50s as government housing. Only a lot of the young mothers who moved in there found their children's health taking a turn for the worse. Started with newborns. Babies that wouldn't wake after a peaceful night's sleep. The kind of deaths that got written off as either negligence or abuse. Screaming teenage girls hauled off to prison on the words of doctors who didn't give a shit. It's always the mother's fault in some people's eyes, and these girls had no one to stand up for them. 2 in the first year, 4 in the next, and they kept on coming for every year until it closed. Wasn't until 1982 that someone traced the source of deaths to tainted water storage on the roof. Toxic metals leaching into the supply. Not enough to kill an adult, but bad news for anyone with weak immune systems. 38 women had been imprisoned by then. Another 23 had killed themselves before they could be sentenced. And those are just the ones accounted for. Not all the deaths were from the water. Andale has a way of being bad for any child's health, no matter the circumstance. More than a few toddlers starved to death as their parents rotted in the tub from an overdose. Even more were lost when they found their parents' stash, little bodies racked with agonizing fits as their panicked mothers screamed for help. One tripped down the elevator shaft because the doors opened as if the carriage was right there. And those are the ones who were found. Plenty more went missing, written off as runaways. In the end, Andale's reputation as a cursed place got so bad the only way out was to shut the whole thing down, board it up, erase it from the records, pretend it never happened and just forget. But Andale kept on killing even after the doors were officially shut. If anything, it only got nastier. Talked to one cop who told me he found a guy dead from sepsis on the 6th floor, couple years after the place was shut down. No one could fucking believe it. They reckon this guy scratched himself on a nail and caught gangrene like it was the 1800s. Never went to the hospital and shoved it against the door. Strange enough on its own, but it was the flag he'd made out of his own clothes that freaked everyone out. He'd scrawled help on it, like he wanted to get someone's attention down below, even though the lock was on his side. He could have left any time he wanted. Cop I spoke to said he was there when they kicked the door down. Still remembers the look in Dead Man's eyes. He was glaring at the door 2 days after he passed, white-knuckled fists gripping a blanket that smelled sickly sweet from all that infection. There were others too, lots of people falling, many of them without a good reason. Got so bad they bricked the roof door, but by the time I arrived, someone had cleared it all away with a sledgehammer. I still don't hang out up there. Not after I first went up and saw pale fingers gripping the ledge, like someone was hanging off it and holding on for dear life. I reckon a lot of people see something like that and think a person needs their help. They go rushing over to offer a hand. But when I saw it, something about those grimy nails set alarm bells off in my head. Fingers looked all wrong, so I took my coat off and used a broom handle to move it closer to the ledge. Sure enough, those ugly hands snatched at the coat and ripped it out to my hands, sending it hurtling to the parking lot below. I've thought about taking a closer look from time to time, but I got a thing about heights and could never bring myself to investigate it much further. You'd think I'd leave, but it's my home. I own it as much as it owns me. People even refer to me as the caretaker now, like they forgot I wasn't always here. Police treat me the same, can you believe that? Any reports of a break-in, and they call me on my number to go take a look, like I'm some sort of official. Only other guy who was here as long as me was the philosopher. I don't know his name, just call him that because of the books he left behind. He came here back when the block was still just a place to live, and he stuck around for a few years after its closure. Lots of notebooks in his flat. Thousands of pages talking about child sacrifice made to gods who don't like being named, along with pictures of strange things frozen in ice and medical photos that look fake. At first I thought he came to document the curse. He has dozens of books just recording all of the strange things he saw, like birds with too many wings, or milk that turned to clotted blood in the bottle. But after going through everything he owned, I found letters to a wife who died in childbirth. He kept her death certificate way at the back of an old-looking box, filled with the letters he'd kept writing her long after the date. Another box, just a row over, had the letters she'd written back. Awful things scrawled on random scraps, shit and blood for ink. He dated them himself, and sometimes wrote notes about how they came to him. Delivered by a rat that was cannibalized in front of me. Pulled by my dentist from a cavity in my mouth. Written in the web of a spider with 13 legs. Anyway, he gives away the real reason he moved to Andale in one of the letters. Says that Andale was the key to helping her, that he was weeks away from figuring out how to open the door. Told his wife he'd bring her back, told her he knew how. I've never figured out where he went next or what happened to him, but his apartment was locked when I found it, and likely would have stayed that way if the key hadn't turned up in my inside pocket on the first morning. Now I live in his old place. It's safe in there. He's written things on the wall that keep everything well behaved, symbols that I don't understand but which are easy to trace, so that's what I do. I go over them every couple of months, and so far they've kept me safe and sane. Because you do need protection in Andale. I don't know when, in its history, the curse went from something mundane to something very real and very dark. It wasn't all just bad luck or poverty. Not by the end, and certainly not anymore. You can't just go strolling around Andale, certainly not at night. It's dangerous. For one thing, it attracts a constant rotation of the deeply unwell who are likely to attack on sight if you're lucky. They usually turn up dead in the halls come morning, although sometimes it's just bits of them, that I come across. Strips of skin floating on the brackish water that floods the basement stairwell, or bloodied fingernails embedded in the ceiling plaster. Weirdest one was a single tooth in a light bulb. Bloody gum still attached to the root, the glass all around it somehow intact. Many of them come here with business, something a little like the philosophers. Rituals, bargains, things like that. It's not a good idea to interrupt them, or to give them even the slightest hint you might be a problem. Every night I lock my door and wait for Andale's business to finish and come. Morning, I do a sweep, floor by floor, and clean up whatever's left of the tower. Blocks strange pilgrims. Most of the rituals don't look real to me. In fact, I reckon a lot of people who come here just end up as victims of something or someone else. There are a lot of reasons to stay out of Andale at night, and most of its visitors strike me as a little naive. Most of what I see looks like it got stolen from a bad death metal album. I once found a book called Satanism and Witchcraft in the 21st Century. It's hard to imagine that the secret inner workings of the universe can be found in something with an ISBN number and 3,000 Amazon reviews. Of course, not all attempts at exploiting Andale's energy are so hackneyed. I had one guy turn up at my door and pay me $3,000 in cash just to show him the darkest corner in the building. I wasn't sure what he meant at first, thought he meant light and shadow. Sort of, he replied when I explained this to him. Darkness like that can be part of it, but I'm looking for a corner. Has to be a right angle or more acute. Ideally, more acute. You understand that term, right? He'd seemed arrogant, and that last sentence confirmed as much. Good-looking guy in his late 20s, nice suit, looked like the stereotypical banker. Acted like one too. Plenty of places like that, I said. Lots of funny rooms in Andale, people trying to make the most of limited space. Sometimes the walls meet at tight angles, sure, but I don't know what you mean about dark. There's the basement. It's flooded. Can't think of anywhere darker than that. He bit his lip and hesitated for a second or two, as if he was actually contemplating it. Not a bad suggestion, actually, but no, too difficult to reach. And I don't just mean dark, as in the absence of light. I mean dark like under the bed. Dark like that one chip in a wall that leads to a hollow space between the bricks, and as a child, you can't help but wonder what lives there. Somewhere that just inexplicably feels like it's not got as much of God's attention on it as everywhere else. I thought about this for a second. His words were vague, but damn if I didn't know what he meant. A corner, I asked, has to be an acute corner. He nodded. I think I know the place, I said, and he smiled like real creep. I took him to a flat on the 8th floor. It was run down like everywhere else, but there was still enough of its old furniture lying around. You can pull open random drawers in there and still see the cutlery people once used. There's even an old analog TV on an old stand. You can perch on what's left of the sofa and stare at that TV and get the feeling you knew the people who lived there once. Run your thumb over the dials on the toaster, the handle of the fridge, or the yellowing plastic of a light switch, and feel an aching loss that creeps up on you out of nowhere. Look up, and you'll see that the light fixture has been torn out of the ceiling, like someone had tried swinging from it. Not a big place, by the way. 3 rooms. A bedroom with a double bed, all rumpled up. A living room/kitchen. And a tiny little spare room that looked like it once would have been used for storage. Or a washing machine, maybe, if you were single and childless. A slither of space, a triangle carved out of whatever room was left over when other more important walls had been put up. That sofa I mentioned, place so whoever was sat down could always keep an eye on that room and its contents. You see, they put a cot inside and it's still there. Blue bottle flies circling overhead. You can't see inside the cot, not unless you went in and actually pulled the blankets out. But it's been decades and no one has managed it yet. It's dark behind those old blankets, a heavy shadow that dissuades a closer look, like there's something in there no one needs to see, and it spent a long time sat there eating what little light there was. Even with a window in that room, daylight doesn't really filter down. Perfect, the businessman said when he saw it. He gazed around the flat one detail at a time, his head pausing for a moment and a smile creeping across his face as he laid his eyes on the broken light fixture. And the cot, the sight of it, the flies that still circled above faded, Winnie the Pooh blankets. It made the breath catch in his throat. "Oh, this is good," he told me. "Dark, like under the bed. You've earned that money. I could have had a dozen men sweep this place, and they wouldn't have understood the brief as well as you have." "Thank you," I replied, even if that wasn't really how I felt. Quietly the man sat down and began to unpack his leather satchel. No pentagrams to be found, although he did unpack 7 strange-looking candles. He caught me looking at them and smiled. "Homemade," he said, "each one shaped by my hands. I'm not a good artist, but it's the effort that counts. Took forever to rend the wax. Of course, that was the easy part. The hard part was getting the fat to make it. Did you know there can be a surprisingly high level of security around a hospital's medical waste department?" "I didn't," I replied, as he took out some flimsy bits of wood and a few small nails. He oh so carefully began to nail the splinters of wood together into what looked like random shapes. "Oh well," he sighed after a few quiet moments, his fingers nimbly gripping the tiny hammer as he tapped away. Already he'd put together at least 6 of the strange little wooden polygons, and with each new one I felt a strange sensation. "Would you like to stay and watch?" he asked. "Absolutely not," I answered. He stopped tapping and smiled once more. "Oh, you're clever," he said. "That's the correct answer, by the way, and if I'm to respect it, I should inform you that now is the safest time to leave." I made my way to the exit, just as he lit the first candles, but not before I looked towards the cot one last time. I was surprised to see a hollow blackness that extended beyond the doorway, like a curtain had been draped across it, only there was depth to it that drew the eye. The businessman paid it no attention, but after a few more seconds, he eventually looked up at me, expectantly. "Can I ask what is it you want?" I said. "Everyone who comes here, I don't get the sense it ever works out for them." "I'm looking for a new kind of afterlife," he replied. "Do you need one?" "We all need one," he said with a wry chuckle, "but only those of us willing to take a few risks will get a better deal. Everyone else," he grimaced, "is worth the bother, but look who I'm speaking to." He looked to the darkness that enveloped the doorway. Shapes could be seen floating past. "You should leave now," he said. I pulled the door shut and, noticing that the sun was rapidly setting, ran to my apartment where I knew the walls would keep me safe. When I returned the next day, the man's satchel was still where I'd last seen it, propped against one arm of the sofa. The candles had burned down to the very end of the wicks and left a lingering smell that's still there all these years later, and of the man himself, well in the room with the cot, which still has blue bottle flies orbiting overhead. There is now a shadow burned into the wall. It's blurry and diffused, but vaguely recognisable as a man on his knees, his head pressed to the floor in a gesture of supplication. I've known it to occasionally move, to turn its head and look towards me, at which my temples throb, my ears pop, and a darkness begins crouch upon the edges of my vision. I never exactly considered that flat to be Disneyland before, but now I avoid it like the plague. Still, it could be worse. Not every ritual ends so cleanly, and at times I've had to personally intervene, something I hate bitterly. If people want to go poking around in the universe's undercarriage, that's their business. It's one thing if I've got to sweep what's left of them up afterwards, but at least that's a one and done job. Sometimes it isn't so clean. One guy turned up and told me he'd be a new resident, my neighbour, and we'd get to know each other. A bumbling old man with an upper-class accent and the look of a professor who was down on his luck. He set up in the room next to mine, and no matter how little I spoke to him, he never really got the hint and kept trying to act like a good friend. Few times I did initiate conversation, it was to tell him the place he'd chosen didn't have much in the way of protection. He pointed to some funny little rashes and told me they were his protection. Over the next few weeks, I'd bump into him from time to time, always on his hands and knees, scraping some dank corner or mouldy pile of bumpy growths. He collected fungi, told me on the first day, and I'd often see him wiping his samples onto petri dishes that he whispered quiet words to whenever he thought I wasn't around. I don't think he was sane, but he probably wasn't completely balmy because he lived long enough to get a sense of Andale and only come out in the day. Meanwhile, his apartment filled up with a growing collection of chittering terrariums and pickle jars, their specimens hidden by murky fluids. All over, he planted and cultivated strange mushrooms and moulds, encouraged them to soak up the darkness of Andale and set them to grow in the rife conditions he'd cultivated. Towards the end, his living room had mushrooms growing out the walls, plaster crumbling beneath microbial armies, until there was only concrete and rebar, and even then, mould continued to grow and thrive. A few times I peered in and found him feeding meat to the frilly growths that exploded out of the old furniture. During this time, the symbols on our shared wall would often grow hot, and I found myself having to replace them on a nearly daily basis as he tinkered away on the other side. I asked him once or twice to tone it down. "This is important work," he growled, an unseen darkness creeping into his voice. "I'm not some ditzy crackhead trying to summon the Baphomet. I'm not looking to get high. This is science. Progress. That's what I'm working towards." "Yeah, well, your progress is trying to eat its way into my flat. Can you ask it to stop?" He stopped, froze in mid-gesture, like I'd said something either profoundly stupid or insightful, or likely a bit of both. He looked at the rashes on his arms that had, by now, started to sprout some of their own strange fruit. When he finally spoke again, it was sly, like a lecherous old man propositioning a nurse. "This fungi," he said. "They had samples of it in the university for 30 years. Can you imagine? They never even realised what they had until I found it and unlocked its potential. Now I've finally found the source, and I can do things no one else thought possible. This entire time, my thesis has depended upon the idea that the fungus has a capacity for information processing way beyond anything we've considered before. And your idea is a good one, you know. Asking it just might be an option." He scuttled off without another word, and for the next few days he set about the building like a furious little honeybee in spring, poking and prodding, setting trap after trap, and cleaning them vigorously of any rats or mice he caught. When I did my morning sweeps, I find him hovering over Andale's latest victims, scraping what was left of them into transparent bags for his own purposes. "Don't mind me," he'd mutter. "It's worthless to you, but these poor souls could help me achieve great things." This persisted for another month. He no longer scraped mould or mushrooms off old apartments. He became interested only in meat, and musty odour that wafted out from under his locked door. It became so bad that I began to wonder if I might have to ask for police help and have him removed when, finally, he simply disappeared from Andale's halls. One morning he was there, annoyingly shooing me out of the way as he lowered jars into the flooded basement, and then the next he was gone, and Andale's halls were silent once more. But that didn't mean he had moved out. Far from it, actually. It took 2 days before I decided to just go ahead and break his door down. I kicked at it with a short, sharp blow, only to find my leg immediately disappeared through wood that had the texture of sodden cardboard. I freed my foot and tried a different tactic, grabbing the handle and pulling so hard that it simply popped right out of the rancid wooden frame. Free to move, the door swung open with an eerie creak, and fetid air, hot and damp, blew out of the room. Inside I found that the man's specimens had gone wild. Terrariums had shattered, their contents spilling outwards. Frogs as large as footballs glared at me from behind furry fronds, and insects with human eyes scuttled away before the amphibians could snatch them up. In one corner, rats had built a hive out of old cardboard, their backs covered with fungal growths that resembled human fingers and other appendages. In another corner, something that looked a little like a black rubber sheet slapped furiously at passing vermin, and it took me a few seconds to realise it was a slime mould. When it finally caught something, it dragged the strange creature squealing into the dark corner, where it grew and constricted around its meal like a fist. I stared at it horrified until one by one black orbs unveiled itself from within the strange mass, and I realised it had eyes to stare right back at me. It was a cacophony of god-awful terror, so gripping that it kept me from hearing the muffled noise of a human struggling to speak. Eventually, it did reach my ears, and I used my torch to light up the far wall without having to actually step inside. I found the scientist half grown into the wall. Algae and moss coated him head to toe so that he was no longer recognisable, but I had to assume it could be no one else. Wide eyes glared at me with terror and pain as nasty little critters nibbled away at what was left of his shins. Meanwhile, strange tendrils probed at his ears and head, never resting for a moment. He kept trying to speak, but the algal growths kept driving their way into his mouth until, one by one, they pushed too far and something snapped. His eyes went wider still. His squeals became hysterical, and his jaws slowly slid further down his chest until it hit the floor with a sodden thump. Finally made contact, I asked. An awful idea if I've heard one. What would a mushroom have to say even in the best of circumstances, let alone one that was grown in the ruins of Andale? I can only assume you never got around to telling it to stay off my wall, did you? No, you probably had your own reason, or doing all of this, and that's what took priority. That made me wonder what it was he'd asked for. As the thought entered my head, I took a quick look around and tried to see if anything particular stood out to me. Something was growing on the sofa that looked strangely human-shaped. It might have been just my imagination, but in the dark it seemed to turn towards me. Meanwhile, the scientist continued to shiver in agony, his eyes focused on me and begging for help. "I'll see what I can do," I said before slamming the door. Something about that strange pile on the sofa had deeply unsettled me. I put the word out, asked for a gun, but got a crossbow instead a few days later. A nervous-looking 16-year-old boy ferried it to my door. I was surprised he'd entered the building, but who knows who'd ordered him to do so. I've acquired a strange sort of respect amongst the locals, and it comes in handy. This boy looked like he would have stamped on my head and robbed me blind any other day, but when he spoke to me, He did so with more respect than I ever imagined I deserved. I thanked him, took the crossbow, spent an afternoon practicing with it, and then used it to kill the scientist the next morning. Took a few hits, but in the end, one thumped into his forehead and shut down his whimpered moans. I didn't see anything on the sofa this time, at least not anything human-shaped, which I was thankful for. After that, it was a simple case of calling the police and beginning a long chain of events that ended with half a dozen men in hazmat suits spraying the room with noxious chemicals. For a while there, I'd been worried that they'd find a corpse and ask questions, but by the time anyone actually entered the room, there was nothing left of the scientist save a splotch on the floor. I never did figure out exactly what it was he was after, although it is not uncommon for my morning sweep to turn up a body, or part of, covered in fungal growths, and I have been known to occasionally catch glimpses of a strange person lowering themselves into the floodwater of the elevator shaft. Of course, I might just be making connections that aren't really there. All sorts of things live in that water. The entire level is flooded, and if something was down there, it'd have free rein over quite a large space. It's a strange world down there. I should know on account of one visitor who gave me a very bad time. I'll call him the fisherman, since he came to Andale because of the flooded basement. Saw a photo that's been circulating around for a while now. If you know where to look, God knows who took it and how, but it shows the flooded stairwell leading to the basement, and beneath the brackish surface is a hand that's all out of proportion. Fingers splayed with perfect symmetry like a starfish. It is reaching up, out of the depths, and resting gently on the third step below the water. When I first met him, he was sitting happily with his feet over the edge of the flooded shaft, water up to his knees, with a rod and line set up beside him. It was quite a surprise at first, seeing him there with a little fly fishing hat, a chubby but healthy-looking man in his 40s with an egg mayo sandwich in one hand and a phone playing Candy Crush in the other. I called out to him as I approached, because in my experience, startling someone in Andale is bad for your health, no matter how sane the visitor appears. He looked up when I caught his attention and smiled amiably. "Hello," he waved with his sandwich. "You're the caretaker." "Yes, I am," I answered. "And you are?" "Just a tourist," he smiled. "Care to join me?" The sun had risen only moments ago. "You weren't here when it was dark, were you?" I asked, more than a little suspicious. "Oh no, you've only just caught me. Been here barely 10 minutes before you showed up. I was told you'd be willing to help in exchange for a small fee." "What sort of help?" I asked. "Oh, just give me a nudge if any of the lines start moving," he said, while pointing to a rod he'd set up beside the basement stairs. The door was propped open, and the line led down into the darkness below, water gently lapping just out of sight. Another line had been set up in a corner of the lobby where the floor had been torn away, revealing a hole straight down into the basement. I can't keep an eye on them all at once, you see. I have bells ready, but, well, 2 heads are better than 1. "What is it exactly you're hoping to catch down there?" I asked. "Are you familiar with the primordial ocean?" he said. "The abyssal waters that God split into light and dark, all that. It's not a physical location per se, but it does connect to certain bodies of water depending on the time and place. Last recorded manifestation was in a glass of old whiskey underneath a forgotten bar in Mexico City. Some poor fellow knocked it over and didn't notice until the following day, when half the bar was suddenly underwater. Quickly rectified, but some of the things swimming in that water were something else, and all from at the bottom of a glass no wider than my wrist. Imagine what we can do with this." he said while gesturing at water by his feet. You think there could be fish alive down there? I asked. At least, he replied. I'd be willing to pay for any reliable information, of course. Do you have any idea what might be down there? Not really, I shrugged, but I guess it wants to be left alone. You might be right there, he said while looking at his other rods. I didn't exactly put down any old lure, you know. He reached into his pocket and took out a strange tuft of fur and ivory, holding it up for me to squint at. A tooth from a man who drowned in the sea. A drone collected it off a shipwreck near the Norwegian coast. The fur is actually red algae that was found growing on his bones. I have plenty of these and, well, other things that might appeal to what's on the other side. My research was thorough and expensive. Come on, take a seat. Flat fee, 1,000. Just sit here until the sun starts to set. I just have to sit, I asked, and let me know if you hear or see anything. I groaned and sat beside him, folding my legs instead of letting them dangle in the water below. Despite my reticence, we stayed like that for several hours. He'd brought lots of food, good homemade stuff, along with plenty of cold beer. We sat there and spoke very little, but we did eat and drink a tremendous amount. Not the kind of thing I do normally, but I was being paid to be there, and I didn't really have anywhere else to be. It was, all in told, a very pleasant afternoon, until I fell asleep. When I awoke, it was with a terrible gasp. My chest was tight like something had been sitting on it, and judging from the terrible giggling and scampering feet I heard running off into the darkness, it might not have been just a feeling. Already, panic was setting in as my eyes darted to the open doors and saw that the moon was out and had been for hours. I fumbled for my torch and turning it on saw that there was no sign of the fisherman. All his stuff had been left behind, yet all that remained of him was his hat that still floated on the water. Even as I watched, a smooth glistening shape curled beneath the water and plucked it off the surface. I recoiled and crawled away from it as fast as I could. This was bad. I knew deep in my heart I'd never been as at risk I was in that moment. The open doors that led outside were tempting, but just beside them were the stairs that led downwards, and I swore I could hear something approaching. I couldn't help but picture the fungal man I'd seen in the scientist's flat. Then again, that basement was huge, and who knows what lay down there. I decided to go for the stairs. The entire time, my heart was in my chest. I had never been caught outside my room at night. Not since my first night when I'd slept in the lobby with my coat pulled over me. You don't get lucky twice, not with Andale, so I knew I had to be careful. I had to be quiet. My only hope was to go unnoticed. I took to stealth, climbing each floor in perfect silence, hiding in well-known spots at the slightest hint of footsteps, human or otherwise. Andale comes alive at night. Whispered mutterings from strange children who descend from air vents, living there for God knows how long. Other times, I saw apparitions, including one, a toddler, the sight of whom made my stomach growl with an insatiable hunger that hurt just to contemplate. She stared at me with pleading eyes as I slunk away from her open door. I might have been tempted to help her, were it not for the sight of the moon peering through her translucent image. And yet, despite all this, I somehow made it to the 14th floor alive. Only it was there right at the final hurdle, so close to safety, that I came across something out of my worst nightmare. A woman stood outside my apartment door, silent, pale, dirt-covered fingernails. It was all too often I'd open my door and find muddy impressions on the floor made by a woman's bare feet. Now I knew who left them every night. I couldn't see her face from where I hid, but something about her seemed profoundly familiar. When she finally turned towards me, I remembered. miller's wife. He had succeeded, it seemed, but I couldn't imagine at what god-awful price, because the woman who stared at me had clearly weathered some years in the grave. It was only the poor lighting and her long hair that had covered up just how bad a state she was in. A lipless grin stared back at me below sunken cheekbones and hollow eye sockets, and yet I could tell that in another life she had been beautiful, which only made the sight all the more gut-wrenching. "My darling," she whispered, and there was something about her voice that I found hard to stay sane in the face of. I don't know why. Over a decade in that place, and I'd borne witness to living nightmares, but it was this walking corpse that pushed me to my limits. The inescapable feeling of loss weighed me down, and without realizing it, I found myself taking steps towards her, even as my knees buckled. By the time I reached her, I was crawling until I could clutch her grimy, icy leg, and that was the last thing I remember before I woke up in my bed the following morning. Everything seemed normal, so completely mundane that I could have written the whole thing off as a bad nightmare. But there were footprints leading from my bed to the door, and later on I found the fisherman's things much as he left them, although when I finally reeled his lines in, I found the lures gone and replaced with bits and pieces of the man who'd first set them up. I threw it all into the water below and decided it would be best to forget him. Every now and again, of course, I can't help but check my peephole at night. I never did before that, but now I do. I see her every single time. She looks sad. Hurts me to think of her out there. It ought to be terrifying, but it's more like someone's ripped out my stomach and heart and let all my insides fall out the bottom. Each time I see her, I wonder what exactly was it he did to bring her back. He leaves only one hint, a final letter, I think. It's not like he dated them. In it he says he would give everything to have her in his arms once more. Not only his life, but everything he's already lived. Every sunset, every good dream, every nightmare, every victory, every loss, every little memory that makes him who he is. He'd give it all just to save her. Sometimes I wonder about him, figuring we'd probably be about the same age. I'd like to think back and imagine what it would have been like for the two of us to meet as young men. But for some reason, whenever I try to remember what my life was like before I came to this city, before I woke up with that coat pulled over me, well, I don't know. It's just hard, that's all. It's almost like there's nothing there, like something reached in and took all the years away. I guess it's just one of those things I'm better off not dwelling on. You won't find Elsewhere Kentucky on any map. The overgrown gravel road leading to the abandoned settlement doesn't even connect to a main road. As with most places you shouldn't go, even Google satellite images have been scrubbed with what looks like a bad use of a blur tool. It was located in southeastern Callaway County, just off the shore of Kentucky Lake. Elsewhere sat surrounded by forest. Until recently, several buildings remained. I'd heard stories about Elsewhere growing up. Being a Callaway County native, I heard most of the local folklore and ghost stories. I spent several nights in Asbury and Old Salem cemeteries, looking to verify stories of creepy ghosts and various monsters. The most I ever got was spooked friends and a bad case of the willies. I was volunteering at the Senior Citizens Centre when Earl, a man of about 80 years old, told me a story about the fall of Elsewhere. It went like this. When I was a boy, my PA and I went to the Elsewhere general store to get some rock candy and chicken feed. I stood outside while PA talked to Mrs. Ellison, the shopkeep. Pa loaded the feed into the truck and handed me the candy. Right about then, there was this loud scream from the schoolhouse. I don't know right well what happened, because PA, him, and later the police did a search but found nothing. Shortly after that, the county disconnected Elsewhere Road from HOI 280. It's been about 60 years, and you're the first person to mention the place in half a century, son. I did some digging after the story. The Callaway County Public Library has a pretty good archive of town history and folklore. I had read every book on the subject, but I'd never seen mention of Elsewhere. I ended up at the Waterfield Library up on the Murray State University campus, looking through old microfilm when I found reference to Elsewhere in the Louisville Courier-Journal. A single paragraph story covered how the unincorporated town was being abandoned for health and safety reasons. It was dated April 2nd, 1953. There was one detail that stood out. Located 2 miles north of New Concord, just off of HY 280, I waited until Saturday morning and I made sure to charge my cell phone before parking roughly 2 miles north of New Concord, just off the side of the road. I moved about 50 yards past the tree line and hiked back and forth until I found the remnants of Elsewhere Road. I followed it northeast for about half a mile before coming to a clearing where several dilapidated buildings stood over the tall grass and broken pavement. I moved closer to the centre of the town when I saw a sign to my left that read, Elsewhere General Store. The windows were boarded up and the door was nailed shut, but after pulling at the boards for a few minutes, I was able to pry it open. The wood was weathered and brittle. It popped right off, leaving the nails in place. I was surprised to see goods on the shelves were left in place. They sat rusted on old wooden shelves. An old-timey cash register sat on a counter to my left, and several burlap sacks lay tattered across the floor. I pressed a few keys on the old mechanical cash register and then pulled a lever to reveal several tarnished coins and some paper money. I had a sandwich in a Ziploc bag I'd brought for lunch, and I decided to eat it before putting the old money in the bag and stuffing it in my backpack. I moved toward the back of the store when an unexpected noise caused me to stand at attention. I caught the distinct sound of footsteps on the wooden porch of the general store. I turned around and peered out the door to see nothing. "Hello? Anyone there?" I called out. There was no response. I crept towards the door slowly with my hands out in front of me just in case. I slowly peeked around each corner before verifying that no one was standing outside and made my way back out to the street. I was sufficiently creeped the fuck out at that point. I decided to pack it in and come back later with friends. It was just about then I heard the crack of thunder. The weather app on my phone said 0 chance of rain, but the clouds overhead were moving in fast. I thought about hoofing it the half mile in the rain, but it came down fast and hard. I didn't want to go back into the general store, so I darted to the nearest building, an old house. The front door was unlocked and the door opened on the second pull. Standing in the parlour, I looked around at the old furniture and dusty floors and decided to sit on an old wooden chair that seemed sturdy enough. The storm raged outside and I could see water coming in from the ceiling. There were several old papers sitting on the coffee table in the living room, and after a while I got up to go look at them. The yellowed papers were single-page editions of an old periodical called the Elsewhere Gazette. The stories covered church events, pie recipes, and an advert for the Elsewhere General Store. One of the papers in the stack bore the headline, Tragedy in the Schoolhouse. The article told the story of a hysterical school teacher who had poisoned the cake she had prepared for the students. The one surviving student ran out of the schoolhouse screaming when the woman tried to force him to eat some of the poisoned cake. It was dated August 12th, 1936. Earl's story put him there nearly 20 years later. I was curious as to what would have happened some 20 years after the tragedy, but not entirely willing to continue investigating. When the rain let up a little, I trudged back towards my car. Around the time I got halfway down Elsewhere Road, the sky cleared up and the rain stopped. When I got back to 280, I marked the spot with a couple of fallen branches propped up against a tree and drove back into town. That night, I was sitting at Mary's kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, when Jerry came in and sat at the table adjacent to mine. Jerry and I didn't talk much, but we would often find ourselves sitting there through the midnight hours, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes. He tapped me on the shoulder this time. "You look like you saw a ghost, kid," he said. "I didn't see one, but pretty sure I heard one," I said, shaking my head. Jerry got a confused look on his face. "I did some hiking out by Elsewhere this morning," I added. Jerry's face went pale. "Bullshit." I showed him a couple of the pictures on my phone. "See that building right there?" he said, pointing at my phone. "Don't go in that building, ever." "I take it that's the schoolhouse," I said. He nodded. "What's the big deal about that place?" "Earl up at the senior centre said he didn't know what happened. I found an old newspaper article from about 20 years before Earl was there, but it didn't explain the scream he heard coming from it in the 50s, I said. Jerry shook his head. "Round here we don't talk about Elsewhere in polite conversation. It ain't one of those things that needs discussing, but I can tell you're all curious, so I'll tell you, and then leave it be." I nodded. I was born in 59, about 6 years after they abandoned the town. It was the 70s by the time I was a dumb teenager looking for a thrill. My buddy Tom Blankenship found pictures of Elsewhere in a book up at the library, saying the town was abandoned in a hurry. We drove his truck out there and found everything boarded up, save for the schoolhouse. Tom went inside the schoolhouse and I stood by the truck. You could still get to Elsewhere Road if you didn't mind driving over some saplings at that point. Jerry lit a cigarette and took a drag. Tom let out this wail like he'd been bit by a snake, and I rushed up to the schoolhouse, expecting to see God knows what. The single-room schoolhouse was empty. I looked all over for Tom, but I couldn't find him. I ended up going to the cops, and that was when they told me about the ghost. Jerry took a long drag and stood up from his chair and moved across from me. There was this sombre look in his eye that told me everything I needed to know about Tom's fate. So the deputy tells me that every couple of years some idiot goes out there and goes in the schoolhouse only for nobody to see them again. Thing is, the county sheriff's department knows about the ghost. He told me that back in the 50s, this kid came to school with a machete and hacked a couple of the kids up. The school teacher ran out screaming. They questioned the kid, and he said this pretty lady that stood outside the schoolhouse from time to time said it would send them to heaven. They ended up putting him under the jail. Jerry put out his cigarette and looked at me with a stern face. "I don't know what happens to the people that go into that schoolhouse, and I don't want to know. Don't go back there. The county should demolish that place," he said. Jerry left a $5 bill on his table and walked out. Despite his story, I was even more curious about Elsewhere at that point. I paid for my coffee and left. By the following Saturday, I was able to wrangle a friend to come with me back to Elsewhere. Katie was a local college student who was obsessed with ghost hunting and abandoned towns. It wasn't very hard to rope her into coming along. I told her the stories as they had been passed down to me, and it was all it took for her to wake me up at 5 a.m. on a Saturday morning with some coffee and a camera ready for a hike. Katie and I strolled into town a little after 7 in the morning. The sky was bright, but the sun was still barely over the trees. We decided to open the doors to the schoolhouse and look inside from a few feet back. I opened the door and shot back off of the soup and back into the grass. It was dark inside and we couldn't make anything out. Katie produced a flashlight and shined it inside the doorway. I could make out a few upturned desks and a chalkboard in the back. We stood there for a bit when the sun crept over the trees and started heating up the morning dew, resulting in a thick fog. I turned for a moment to look back at the general store when Katie darted past me into the schoolhouse. I immediately ran after her, and we both stood in the dilapidated building as I begged her to go back outside. "I could have swore I saw a kid standing in here," she said. "Yeah, that's great. Spooky kids. First time I was here it rained out of nowhere. Now it's fog. Let's go," I said. Katie walked a few steps forward and let out a yelp as she fell through a hole in the floorboards to the cellar down below. I laid flat on the floor and reached my arm down for her to climb up. She grabbed my wrist, and I grabbed her with my other hand and tried to roll back to pull her up. She wouldn't budge. I looked back down and saw a half-transparent woman holding on to Katie's legs and pulling her into the darkness. I pulled harder as Katie started screaming. The ghostly woman looked up at me and smiled in the dim light of the morning shining from the door. Katie was pulled quickly into the darkness, and in the struggle, I too was pulled down into the cellar. Katie fell silent after I pulled a couple of glow sticks from my backpack and cracked them open. I tossed one in her direction and one towards the other end of the room, and brought up the flashlight app on my phone. Katie sat slumped against the wall on the far side of the room. There were bones all over the room in various states of decay. I walked over to Katie and checked her pulse at the neck. It was faint, but it was there. I turned towards the back of the room, and that is when I noticed a small sliver of light coming from two wooden cellar doors about 20 or so feet from me. I crept past the scattered bones and over to the cellar doors. I tried to open them, only to hear chains rattle on the other side. I pushed harder and kept banging at them until one of the hinges broke. I pushed the doors open and went back for Katie and threw her over my shoulder. As I walked towards the opening, I felt a sharp pain across my back. I didn't look back. Instead, I bolted for the light. I tripped over a corpse and fell to the ground. My cell phone slid across the floor. I looked back, and the ghostly woman was almost on top of me. I bolted up, grabbed Katie by the wrist, and took off for the stairs leading to freedom, dragging the young co-ed behind me. Just as I crossed the threshold into the light, I felt a tug and looked back to see the woman holding Katie by the leg. I tugged and pulled and cursed and fought. This otherworldly voice came from the apparition saying, "Let her go to heaven." "Go to hell," I shouted. The woman's grip on Katie loosened, and I fell back onto the soft grass, with Katie landing on top of me. I didn't wait around for her to show up again, so I fireman carried her back to my car. In my report to the deputy, I mentioned all the bodies I found down in the schoolhouse. He would later tell me they recovered 16 skeletons and one corpse that had been there for just a few years. The county board voted to demolish the town shortly thereafter. It was all kept hush-hush. Elsewhere, road was tilled with a backhoe after the remaining buildings were bulldozed and the cellar of the schoolhouse filled with concrete. I went back out there one last time, just to make sure it was gone, and I didn't make it 5 feet toward the tree line before a deputy sheriff flashed his lights and told me to get back in my car. Katie won't talk to me anymore. Last I saw her, she pretended she didn't see me and scurried away. Of all of the things that I experienced in that town, I regret not grabbing my cell phone. I had some pretty decent pictures. There's no record of Elsewhere, Kentucky. Now, there's nothing left of the town. I haven't been back, and from the way the county has been handling it, I don't think there is anything to go back to. But, just in case, don't go to Elsewhere, Kentucky. I just wanted to say thank you for the overwhelming support and love you guys have shown me, and thank you for joining me on my journey. Also, I want to thank today's video sponsor, Dubby Energy. Today's video is brought to you by Dubby Energy, the ultimate energy drink designed for gamers, creators, and anyone who needs a boost without the crash. Unlike those other energy drinks loaded with sugar and junk, Dubby is packed with clean ingredients to fuel your focus, energy, and performance all day long. Whether you're grinding through a gaming session or just need that extra push to get through your day, Dubby's got you covered. And the best part, it's jitter-free. No weird crashes, just clean, sustained energy. Check out the link in the description below and use my code WETT at checkout to save 20% off your order. Yes, that's right, not 10, but a whopping 20% off. Power up with Dubby Energy and stay on top of your game. A huge thank you to Dubby for sponsoring this video.